My name is Jared Eaton. I'm 58 years old, and I work with my hands. Always have. Always will. I inherited Eaton Leatherworks from my father, just like he did from his. It's not some hobby or side business. It's a legacy built with sweat, patience, and the kind of skill that takes a lifetime to perfect. I teach young men the trade, pass down what I know, and I take pride in the work. But all of that, the long nights, the early mornings, the years spent carving out a life with Elise, meant nothing to her. Not enough, anyway. I found out on a Monday. That's the kind of thing that sticks with you, the little details. It was a long day at the shop, orders piling up, the smell of leather and oil thick in the air. I came home later than usual, expecting to hear the usual noise of dinner being made, the sound of the TV playing in the background. Instead, it was quiet. Too quiet. Elise sat at the kitchen table, her phone face down next to a half-empty glass of wine. She looked up, startled, like I'd caught her doing something she shouldn't. "Didn't hear you come in," she said, voice soft, almost careful. I looked at the phone. A simple thing, but it might as well have been a flashing neon sign. I wasn't stupid. A man knows when something's off. For weeks, maybe months, she'd been different, always tired, always distracted. When I reached for her at night, she'd turn away, mumbling about being exhausted. I let it go, figured she was just worn out from the kids, from life. I worked too much, and I knew it. Maybe that was on me. But there comes a moment when a man has to stop making excuses. I sat down across from her, pulled my phone from my pocket, and slid it across the table. The screen was lit up with messages, ones I'd forwarded to myself from our shared laptop. I didn't say a word, just watched. Her face drained of color. She didn't even reach for the phone. "Jared." "How long?" My voice was steady. I wasn't going to let her see me break. She swallowed hard, eyes darting to the side, like she could find an answer written on the damn wall. "It's not what you think." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "It's exactly what I think." "How long?" Her mouth opened and closed before she sighed, shoulders slumping. "A few months." A few months. That meant it wasn't some one-time mistake. It was a choice, over and over again. I nodded, slow and deliberate. "Vince Faulkner." She flinched at the name. That told me everything I needed to know. Vince, the smooth-talking lawyer who'd been handling some family estate nonsense for her parents. The same bastard who always had a too-perfect smile and a suit that probably cost more than my truck. I'd never liked him. Now I knew why. "It's over," she said quickly, her hands twisting together. "I ended it." I scoffed, shaking my head. "You ended it because you got caught." She had the nerve to look hurt. "Jared, I never meant for this to happen." I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the hardwood. "Yeah? Funny thing about affairs, they don't just happen." I grabbed my jacket and walked out. I needed air, needed space, needed to think. The next few days were a blur of work, trying to keep my hands busy while my mind worked through the wreckage. I kept running over it in my head, every late night at the shop, every time she told me she was meeting up with friends, every little detail I'd ignored because I trusted her. But trust is like leather. Once it's torn, you can't make it whole again. I wasn't the kind of man to throw a fit or go knocking on Vince's office door looking for a fight. That's what he'd expect, what Elise probably expected too. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I started planning. Revenge wasn't the right word for it. Justice was more like it. People like Vince, they didn't just hurt one person and walk away clean. No, they left a trail. I just had to find it. I didn't say a word to Elise for the next few days. She didn't push. Maybe she knew better, or maybe she was too ashamed. Either way, I wasn't interested in her explanations. I was interested in Vince. The man thought he was untouchable, slick suits, smooth words, a firm handshake that hid a snake's grip. I'd seen his type before. He played people like it was second nature, and Elise had been an easy mark. I wasn't going to confront him in some petty way, throwing punches in a parking lot. That's how you get yourself arrested. No, I wanted something lasting. The kind of consequence that couldn't be shrugged off or smoothed over with a fake apology. And for that, I needed information. The first place I went was McCaffrey's, the bar where half the town's working men ended up after a long day. I nursed a whiskey and waited. Sure enough, after an hour, I spotted a familiar face, Dean Mitchell, a retired cop who used to do security work for some of the bigger firms in town. He'd always had an ear to the ground, and more importantly, he had no love for lawyers. "Jared," he greeted, sliding onto the stool next to me. "Haven't seen you in here much." I shrugged. "Been busy." He nodded, then eyed my drink. Trouble. I let out a slow breath. Let's just say I've got an interest in a man named Vince Faulkner. Dean scoffed, swirling his beer. Yeah, I'll bet. The guy's a vulture. Gets his claws into people, especially women in bad spots. That why you're asking? I lifted my glass slightly in confirmation. No need to spell it out. Dean glanced around, then leaned in. He's got a history. Likes to take cases that put him close to vulnerable people. Divorces, estate issues, that kind of thing. Had a hell of a scandal a few years back. Almost lost his license. Rumor was, he was screwing a client and using privileged information to squeeze her ex for a better settlement. The Bar Association let him off with a warning. That was exactly what I needed to hear. Think anyone still has dirt on him? Dean smirked. You'd be surprised what people hold on to. I'll make a few calls. I left a 20 on the bar and walked out, the wheels already turning in my head. If Vince had played this game before, it meant there were people out there who hated him as much as I did. I just had to find them. I spent the next day making quiet inquiries. Old business owners, women who had crossed paths with him, even a guy I knew at City Hall. Turns out, Vince was sloppier than he looked. He'd cut corners, made enemies, and, best of all, left a paper trail. And then there was the real gold mine. Elise's father, Richard Caldwell. Richard was a hard man. Old school, built his business from the ground up, and didn't have much patience for liars. He'd never been my biggest fan, but he respected me. When I asked for a meeting, he didn't hesitate. We met at his country club, a place I never set foot in unless I had to. The second I sat down across from him, I got straight to it. Richard, I assume you know about Elise. He set his coffee down, jaw tightening. I know. I need to know where you stand. He studied me for a long moment. You want me to clean up her mess? No, I said flatly. She made her choices. But the man she chose? He's got a history of using women like her. And I'm guessing he's got some leverage over your family, considering how close he's been with Elise's legal matters. Richard exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping against the table. He does. Then let's take it back. That's the thing about men like Richard. They don't waste time on emotion. They deal in strategy. We spent the next hour talking logistics. By the end of it, he had what he needed to cut Vince out of the family's affairs, and I had what I needed to ruin Vince's career. The final step was the public reckoning. Elise's parents were hosting a family gathering that weekend. Everyone important would be there. Her family, our mutual friends, people whose opinions actually mattered. The perfect setting for the kind of justice Vince wouldn't walk away from. I went home that night and sat in my shop, the smell of leather and polish grounding me. I took out an old journal, the kind I used to sketch designs in, and started writing. Not about the past, but about what came next. When the time came, I'd be ready. Saturday rolled around, and with it came the kind of crisp autumn air that made a man feel sharp. The leaves were turning, the smell of barbecue and cigar smoke drifted through the Caldwell estate, and people gathered in small groups, laughing and talking like nothing was wrong. Like there wasn't a storm brewing right in the middle of their little world. I pulled up slow, parking my truck at the edge of the long gravel driveway. The house was one of those big, old brick places, the kind that had been standing for generations, built by men who understood what it meant to work for what they had. Elise's family had money, but it wasn't new money. They had roots, respect. And after tonight, Vince Faulkner would never set foot on this land again. I stepped out, adjusted my jacket, and let my gaze sweep the scene. Vince was here already, standing near the outdoor bar, drink in hand, smiling that politician's smile as he talked to Elise's uncle. Elise was a few feet away, arms crossed, tense but trying not to show it. She saw me, and something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe? Hope. Foolish. That ship had sunk the moment she let another man into our marriage. Richard Caldwell caught my eye from across the patio. He gave me the smallest nod. He was ready. I walked in slow, greeting people as I went. Firm handshakes, polite smiles, nothing out of the ordinary. A man doesn't tip his hand before the cards hit the table. Elise stepped in front of me before I could reach the porch. Jared, can we talk? Her voice was low, careful. I looked past her, toward the house. Not now. Please. She touched my arm, but I pulled away like she burned me. Too late for that, I said, and kept walking. Inside, the dining room was set up for a formal announcement. That was Richard's idea. If Vince wanted to slither his way into the family, we'd let him think he was succeeding. Just long enough to cut his legs out from under him. Richard stood at the head of the room. glass raised. Before we eat, I want to say a few words. The room quieted. Family is the most important thing. We take care of our own, protect our own, and we hold ourselves to a higher standard. I stepped forward, setting a leather-bound book on the table. That's why it's only right we get everything out in the open. Vince's smile faltered. Elise's breath hitched. I flipped open the book. The first few pages held old family photos, pictures of Elise and me over the years. Our wedding day, the kids as babies, moments that should have meant something. But the next few pages? They were something else entirely. Screenshots of text messages, hotel receipts, photos of Vince and Elise, taken at just the right moments. The room went silent. Elise gasped, hand flying to her mouth. Vince set his drink down a little too hard, face paling. Richard turned to him, voice low, even. You've been handling my family's legal affairs. That ends tonight. Vince cleared his throat, trying to recover. Richard, let's not jump to conclusions. No, I cut in. Let's. I turned to Elise. You wanted to talk? Talk now. Her lips parted, but no words came. I looked back at Vince. You thought you could walk into my life, into my family, and take what wasn't yours. You thought no one would find out. Vince straightened, slipping into lawyer mode. Jared, be reasonable. I stepped in close, lowering my voice so only he could hear. I have enough to make sure you never practice law in this state again. And Richard? He has enough pull to make sure no firm touches you. He swallowed hard. I turned back to the room. I won't waste any more of your time. I grabbed my book, tucked it under my arm. Dinner's on me. Enjoy. And with that, I walked out, leaving them to pick up the pieces. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a reset button. Inside, voices rose, sharp and frantic, the kind of noise people make when their perfect little world cracks right down the middle. I didn't turn back. The hard part was done. Now, it was just about watching the fire spread. I leaned against the railing of the porch, pulled a cigarette from my pocket, and lit it. I wasn't a heavy smoker, but some nights called for it. Tonight was one of them. The door behind me swung open. Heavy steps, deliberate. Richard. He came up beside me, hands in his pockets. We stood there for a moment, both watching the party unravel. Elise's mother had sunk into a chair, shaking her head. Her sister looked horrified. And Vince, well, Vince was trying to slither his way out of it, fast-talking his way through excuses that weren't landing. Richard let out a slow breath. You handled that clean. Had to. I flicked ash onto the porch. Men like him count on people getting emotional, losing their heads. You keep your head, you win. He nodded, like he already knew that. I should have caught this sooner. Wouldn't have mattered. I glanced at him. She wanted it. His jaw tightened. I raised her better than that. Maybe, I said, taking another drag. But she made her choice. The screen door swung open again. Elise. She hesitated at the threshold, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. Jared. I exhaled smoke, watching it curl into the air. Not here. Please. Her voice was tight, raw. Just 5 minutes. Richard didn't move, didn't even look at her. He'd already made up his mind about how this night was ending. I took one last drag and flicked the cigarette away, then nodded toward the side yard. 5 minutes. I walked off the porch, past the stone pathway, stopping near an old oak tree. Elise followed, slow like she was walking to her own funeral. When she spoke, her voice was small. I never wanted to hurt you. I looked at her, really looked. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Whatever pain she was in, she'd built it herself. I crossed my arms. Then why'd you? She swallowed. I felt like I was disappearing. Like I was just a wife. A mother, I finished. And that wasn't enough? Tears welled in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I was lonely, Jared. So your answer was to crawl into bed with another man? My voice was steady, cold. She flinched. I don't expect you to forgive me. Good, I said. Because I won't. Her chin trembled. I miss you. I let out a short, humorless laugh. You don't miss me, Elise. You miss the life I built for you. You miss not having to worry about what comes next. She blinked fast, shaking her head. That's not fair. No. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. What's not fair is coming home to a woman who let another man touch her and then lying to my face about it. What's not fair is busting my ass to provide, to build something real, while you threw it away for a goddamn fantasy. She sniffed, rubbing her arms. So that's it. That's it. I turned, walking back toward the house. Jared, her voice cracked, but I didn't stop. She'd made her choice months ago. Now, she had to live with it. As I stepped onto the porch, Richard met my eyes, then nodded once. No words needed. Inside, the party was over. People were leaving, their faces tight, whispering among themselves. Vince was nowhere to be seen. Good. I walked out to my truck, climbed in, and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, Elise stood alone under the oak tree, shoulders shaking. I didn't feel anything. Not anger. Not sadness. Just relief. I put the truck in drive and pulled away, heading towards something better. I got back to the shop late that night. The place was dark except for the old green desk lamp in the corner, casting long shadows over the workbench. The smell of leather and dye hung thick in the air, familiar, steady. I ran a hand over a half-finished belt, the pattern still rough, needing more time, more care. Work didn't lie to you. A bad stitch was a bad stitch, a weak strap would snap, and there was no smooth talk or excuses that could change that. If only people were built the same way. I poured myself a drink, sat down, and just listened to the quiet. For the first time in months, it didn't feel heavy. No more guessing, no more wondering if Elise was pulling away because she was tired or because she was pulling towards someone else. The truth was out, and it was ugly, but at least it was solid. I could work with solid. The next morning, I did what I always did. Opened the shop, turned on the radio, and got to work. I had orders to fill, apprentices to teach, and a business to run. Elise might have turned our life into a mess, but she wasn't taking this from me. Midway through the day, I heard the bell above the door. Looked up to see Danny, one of my younger guys, standing there looking like he wasn't sure if he should have come in. "You hear about last night?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, my old man was there. Said you handled it like a damn general." I smirked, going back to cutting a new strap. Just did what needed doing. Danny hovered for a second, then stepped forward. "You all right, boss?" I paused, then nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." He studied me for a second, then gave a sharp nod. "Good. 'Cause we got a problem with that saddle order. Stitching's pulling wrong. Finally, something worth my time." I stood up, setting my tools down. "Show me." The day passed fast. Work had a way of doing that. The guys knew better than to bring up Elise, which I appreciated. By closing time, I had a dozen new orders lined up. My hands sore in the good way, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't dreading going home. Evening settled in, and I found myself at McCaffrey's, the town bar, with Earl, an old friend I hadn't seen in a while. He'd been a trucker for decades before retiring, tough as nails, with a handshake like a vice. "Saw your little show at the Caldwell place," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "About time someone put that lawyer in his place." I shrugged. Man thinks he's smarter than everyone else. Turns out, he's just another idiot who got caught. Earl chuckled, shaking his head. "Elise come crawling back yet?" I exhaled sharply. "She tried. Won't make a difference." "Damn right it won't," he said. "You're better off." I didn't argue. The truth was, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying something for so long I forgot how heavy it was until I finally set it down. The town knew what happened. Some would whisper, some would take sides, but at the end of the day, I wasn't the one who had to live with the shame. Elise and Vince had earned that all on their own. Earl lifted his glass. "To rebuilding." I clinked mine against his. "To better things." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. A few weeks passed, and life settled into something steady again. Work was good, better than ever, actually. Orders were coming in faster than I could fill them. Word had gotten around about the craftsmanship at Eaton Leatherworks, and people respected a man who stayed solid when everything around him fell apart. I'd always believed in keeping your head down and letting your work speak for itself, and now that was paying off. Elise had moved out. She was staying in some rental across town, trying to pick up the pieces. I didn't ask how she was doing, and I didn't much care. The divorce was in motion, and as far as I was concerned, that chapter was done. She had the life she chose. Whether or not it was what she expected was her problem now. As for Vince, well, he was having a harder time. His firm cut him loose, too much bad press, too many whispers. Nobody wanted to do business with a man who couldn't even keep his own personal life in order, especially not in a town like this, where people had long memories. Last I heard, he was trying to get work in the next city over, but doors weren't opening the way they used to. Poetic justice. One evening, I was in the shop finishing up a custom order when the doorbell chimed. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked up. Eleanor Walker stood there, leaning against the doorframe with a look that said she wasn't just passing by. She was a widow, Ran the local feed store after her husband passed. Tough woman, no nonsense, but kind when she wanted to be. Heard you finally ran that snake Faulkner out of town, she said, stepping inside. I smirked. Didn't have to do much. Just let him ruin himself. She glanced around at the shop, eyes lingering on the rows of belts and saddles hanging from the walls. Business seems to be booming. Can't complain. She nodded, then tilted her head at the workbench. That the saddle for the McGregor boy? Yeah, I said, brushing off a stray piece of leather. Kid's been waiting on it. She ran a hand over the tooled pattern. Beautiful work. I shrugged. Just doing what I know. She looked at me. Really looked. You ever think about slowing down? Maybe taking a day off? I let out a short laugh. And do what? She smiled, shaking her head. You're a damn workhorse, Jared. Better than the alternative, I said, setting down my tools. Keeps me steady. She nodded like she understood. Well, if you ever feel like having a meal that isn't takeout or bar food, I know a place. I met her eyes, considering. She wasn't asking for anything I wasn't ready to give. Just an invitation, nothing more. I nodded. Might take you up on that. She smiled, tipping her chin. You know where to find me. After she left, I sat back down at my workbench, running my fingers over the rough edges of the leather, thinking. About work, about the future, about the weight that wasn't there anymore. I picked up my tools and got back to it. Some things, after all, were still worth building. A year passed, and the world kept moving, same as it always had. My shop was busier than ever, my name carried weight, and I was finally living life on my own terms. No more guessing, no more waiting for someone else to figure out what they wanted. I knew exactly who I was, and that was more than enough. Vince Faulkner, last I heard, was scraping by in some second-rate practice 2 towns over. His reputation never quite recovered. Turns out, when you build your career on manipulation and charm, it only takes one good hit to send it all crumbling. Word spread about what happened at the Caldwell gathering, and in a place like this, a man's name is everything. His name was Mud now. No one trusted a lawyer who couldn't keep his own house in order. A few months back, a guy I knew in real estate mentioned Vince was selling his house, downsizing. Fitting. Elise? She was still around, living small, working some jobs she never thought she'd have to. The rental she moved into turned permanent, and the fancy lifestyle she was used to dried up along with Vince's money. She had no alimony to lean on, Richard saw to that. A woman who spent years looking for an escape ended up trapped in a life she never wanted. She tried to talk to me once, ran into me outside the hardware store, but I didn't stop walking. Some doors, once closed, don't open again. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the shop was quiet, just me and Danny, my best apprentice, finishing up orders. The radio played something old, the scent of tan leather thick in the air. Danny was working a belt, eyes narrowed in concentration, tongue poking out the side of his mouth like a kid. Not bad, I said, leaning over to inspect the stitch work. But you rushed that edge. Gotta take your time. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Thought I had it. I pulled my own belt off the hook on the wall, the one my father made me when I was Danny's age. The leather was worn, but the craftsmanship was solid, every stitch perfect, every detail clean. This took him hours to finish. Every pass of the needle, every stroke of the tool, meant to last. I set it down in front of him. A bad stitch? That's a weak point. And one weak point is all it takes for something to fall apart. Danny studied it, then nodded, picking up his work again. Got it. I watched him for a second, then stepped back, arms crossed. Teaching these boys, passing down what I knew, that was what mattered. Not Elise, not Vince, not the past. That was just wasted time. The door opened, and Eleanor walked in, hands tucked in the pockets of her coat. She gave me a knowing look. You never stop, do you? I smirked. Somebody's got to keep these boys in line. She leaned against the counter. Well, I'm here to tell you dinner's in an hour. You showing up, or am I eating alone? Danny glanced up, then back down fast, pretending not to listen. I grabbed my hat off the peg. I'll be there. She smiled, tipping her chin. Good. After she left, I took a last look around the shop. The workbench was full, the shelves stocked, the next generation of leather workers putting in the hours. I stepped outside, locking up behind me, feeling the evening air settle in. The past had burned down to nothing but embers. What mattered now was the work, the future, and the solid ground beneath my feet. I walked toward my truck, toward dinner, toward whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt right.